Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining today's webinar on Looking Beyond the Regulations, Potential Safety Hazards. My name is Kristen. I'm a Government Relations Representative at the American Apparel and Footwear Association. We are going to start today's program with a quick update on AAFA, and then we'll move into our content for today. AAFA is the largest trade association in the U.S., representing apparel and footwear brands, retailers, wholesale companies, and the supplier community, all of whom produce and distribute products across global markets. AAFA focuses on three core areas critical to the business operations of our members: brand protection, trade, and supply chain and manufacturing. Under its mission of advocacy that fits, AAFA provides members with expertise across these disciplines, along with personalized casework and educational programming, such as today's webinar, to help members navigate the complex global marketplace. Members gain unparalleled access to resources, tools, and special interest committees that deliver exclusive insights on regulation, compliance, and policy, as well as networking and collaboration opportunities. Two quick housekeeping notes before we get started. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type those into the question box in your GoToWebinar control panel. We'll bring up those questions during the question and answer segment following the presentation. Also, we're recording today's webinar. That will be available for download along with the presentation deck on AAFA's Learning Center within 48 hours. If you experience any technical difficulties throughout the program, please go to GoToWebinar support at 1-800-263-6317. Today's program is sponsored by QIMA, and we have a great program planned. I'm delighted to introduce today's presenter, Susan DeRagon, who is the Senior Technical Consultant at QIMA. Susan DeRagon works for QIMA, formerly Asia Inspection. With over 30 years of experience, she is leading quality and safety expert on toys, children's products, and promotional and licensed goods. She has conducted numerous technical seminars and webinars globally. She works closely with companies to provide the highest level of quality service in the areas of regulatory compliance, product testing, quality control and assurance, safety evaluations, and inspections. She is an active member of the Toy Association, ASTM International, participating on several toy and children's product standards committees. She is also a member of PPAI's Product Responsibility Action Group and a previous member of the Board of Directors for ICFSO, the International Consumer Product Health and Safety Organization. Susan received a bachelor's degree in business administration from Bay Path College, magna cum laude. The three key learning objectives that we will cover today include how to identify potential hazards in products that comply with regulations, how to mitigate risks associated with potential hazards and consumer use and misuse, risk management techniques that may be used throughout the product lifestyle. And with that, Susan, please begin.
Great. Well, thank you, Kristen. And thank everyone for joining us today. It's really been my pleasure to work with AAFA. I have been a longtime member, and QIMA is pleased to support AAFA as a sponsor. And so today we're going to share some of our recommendations on helping to ensure that product is safe and not just compliant to the mandatory regulations. And so we're going to start with a brief introduction into why it's important to look beyond the regulations. Regulatory compliance does not necessarily equal safety. And we'll get into some detail about how to identify potential hazards and some of the resources that can be used. And then once you've identified the potential hazards associated with your product, then a risk assessment is needed to determine the potential risk that these hazards may present. And then we'll talk about risk management, steps that can be taken at each phase of a product's life cycle to mitigate the risks and produce consistently compliant and safe product. And so let's start by acknowledging that every consumer product has risk. Take shoes, for example. Pretty much everyone has them and knows how to use them. And yet, there are potential hazards with shoes, which may result in consumer injury and even recalls. There are metal pieces that can poke through the sole, and metal rivets around shoelaces that can cause lacerations, some even resulting in stitches. There are steel-toed work boots that fail to protect the user's feet. Heels can become unstable or break and cause falls. And with children's shoes, one needs to ensure that toggles or any decorative pieces do not detach and present a potential choking hazard. The shoes shown here have all been recalled for one reason or another. But even if the potential or perceived risk doesn't result in a recall, there's social media and the saferproducts.gov website where consumers can share their concerns with a product. There are numerous complaints in this database about certain performance sneakers and people falling or otherwise becoming injured. So with any consumer product, the potential risks need to be identified and addressed. So how do we do this? For regulated products, as we know, compliance is mandatory. But as mentioned, it's important to note that regulatory compliance is a minimum requirement. Many recalled products comply with the applicable regulations, and yet were found to cause injury or present a hazard to consumers. And thus the need to look beyond the mandatory regulations and evaluate product for potential hazards. Understanding your supply chain, including raw materials and chemicals used in your product, is critical. And once a compliant product is made, you still need to take steps to ensure continued compliance. You know, if you receive the CPSC recall notices, you know that almost every day safety-related recalls are occurring. These are just some of the recent CPSC recalls. The clothing items shown here were recalled due to violation of the federal flammability standard, a mandatory regulation that's been in place since the 1950s. Disappointingly, there continue to be recalls due to flammability violations. And the other products shown here were in compliance with the mandatory regulations and yet presented a potential hazard. From a federal standpoint, children's clothing and accessories are exempt from the small parts regulation, yet these bibs were recalled because the snaps detached, and the socks were recalled due to small part detachment as well. Feeding products, such as drinking vessels, are also technically exempt from the small parts regulation, yet the water bottle shown here was recalled because the small spout could detach. The helmet was recalled due to mold in the fabric inside the helmet. And the handmade doll was recalled due to a sewing needle found inside the stuffing. Hazardous magnets detached from the yellow trivet, which are a significant hazard to children, even though the trivet's a general use item and not a toy. The head support was overstuffed on this infant item, which could result in suffocation. And the axle on these skates became loose, resulting in the wheel separating from the skates frame, posing a fall hazard. Not necessarily regulatory violations, but certainly potential hazards to the consumers. And let's not forget chemical issues. These are not necessarily regulated from a U.S. federal standpoint, but they may be covered by California Proposition 65 or by international regulations. The gloves shown here and the lederhosen contained unacceptable levels of hexavalent chromium, Chrome 6. In Australia, children's and women's clothing was recalled due to azo dyes, which are regulated in Europe and are included in many restricted substances lists, including AAFAs. And there were similar chemical issues with the Victoria's Secret bras and the American Airlines uniforms, both of which caused rashes and other skin irritation, likely due to chemicals in the garments. There are many potential issues. So let's look at the hazard identification process, what you need to consider when identifying potential hazards, and the resources that are available to help you do so. One of the things you need to consider is how the consumer may interact with your product. Human factors is an area of psychology that studies the relationship between people, their environment, and the objects in their environment. And this type of evaluation tries to anticipate foreseeable use and unintended use scenarios. It's certainly foreseeable that children will go up the slide as well as down it. So you should consider this use to minimize any hazards with going up the slide. And the goal for human factors is to maximize the product user performance by designing products to accommodate human variability and anticipated foreseeable use. Designing for comfort, fit, and functional use can help reduce injury from the use and misuse. So for example, an infant car seat is designed to fit a child as he or she grows. Using this product in a manner not intended or introducing additional products to be used with the product raises the likelihood of injury. Looking at this picture, we see that introducing a pillow angles the child's head, and using the car seat as a sleeping environment limits body motion. The infant's head is kept in a bent position toward the chest, which can restrict the airway and limit oxygen supply. So in trying to determine potential use and foreseeable unintended use, a behavioral task analysis can be useful. And this type of analysis can help identify potential hazards at every step associated with product use. It covers everything from opening the packaging of the product to its assembly and use. Can it be misassembled and still used? That can present a hazard. Does it function with batteries incorrectly inserted, which can result in overheating and fire? Can it be used without safety guards in place? How does the user clean it? Is there a potential hazard there if it can be cleaned while it's still turned on? If the product's not working properly, how could a consumer try to troubleshoot the problem on their own? And where and how will it be stored? With the paper shredders, for example, one knows the intended use and the potential issues with finger laceration if you don't use it properly. But how about cleaning the product? Those teeny bits of paper can be difficult to clear away completely, and there have been accidents, mini explosions and fire caused by using compressed air to try to blow them away, because compressed air can contain flammable chemicals. So clear directions on how to effectively clean the product and warning against use of compressed air may be needed. With certain juicers, if assembly is not done perfectly, if the filter basket is not placed properly, it can crack or shatter and spray the user with dangerous bits of sharp plastic. Ensuring that a product would not function unless everything was properly fitted could help to avoid an issue such as this. And there are numerous resources available to help you identify potential hazards, including those listed here. And we're going to discuss each of these further. Even if you're just distributing product in the United States, look at the international regulations for your product type that can help you identify potential hazards. Europe, in particular, takes a precautionary approach to product safety, and so has significantly more chemical restrictions than the US federal regulations. And the international standards may cover issues not addressed by the US standards, such as nickel release, heavy metals, azo dyes, flame retardants, colorfastness, the list goes on. Not saying you need to fully comply with an international standard if you're selling in the US only, but it's good to know what's regulated in other countries that could present an issue with US customers. And look at industry standards. These may not have the mandatory compliance of the federal regulations, but may address issues such as durability and life cycle usage of a product to help identify potential hazards. These include ASTM and ANSI standards, as well as UL, AATCC, and others. The ASTM zipper pull test may have helped avoid the recall in the pictured jacket was recalled due to the zipper pull detachment, which resulted in a small parts choking hazard as well as a laceration hazard. The UL standard addresses potential fire hazards associated with hoverboards, many of which were recalled. And you should consider whether the so-called voluntary standards are really voluntary. Just because it's not a federal regulation, it's important to note that the CPSC expects compliance when an industry standard addresses the safety of a product. The industry standards provide that additional safety factor. And then recalls of similar products are a valuable resource that provides insight into how a product was used or misused and found to present a hazard when in the marketplace. Looking at recalls of products similar to yours or with similar functions or configurations can help you design out those hazards if possible or otherwise address them. So listed here are various international recall sites. You can subscribe to most of these free of charge and receive automatic emails whenever a recall occurs. CPSC and Health Canada issue recall notices when recalls occur, which is an almost daily occurrence. Europe's RAPEX system provides a weekly update. And these recall sites are searchable. The Global Recalls portal brings together information on product recalls being issued around the world on a regular basis together in one place. It's on an OECD platform. And the portal includes information on mandatory and voluntary consumer product recalls, which were issued by a government body and were made publicly available. So as part of a product evaluation, a hazard identification process, recalls can play an important part. Learn from them. And one can also review and analyze existing data. Much of this involves injury and incident data of similar product or product with similar characteristics. And there's various databases available. The Consumer Product Safety Commission has the NICE database, which I use a lot whenever I'm evaluating a product for potential hazards. NICE stands for National Electronic Injury Surveillance System. It's been in use for over 30 years, and it includes data from the emergency departments of 100 hospitals selected as a probability sample of all 5,300 plus U.S. hospitals with emergency departments. Patient information is collected from each NICE hospital for every emergency room visit involving an injury associated with a consumer product. And then there are human factors publications through the Human Factors in Ergonomics Society, NIH, the National Institute of Health, publications and other research papers that can be used as resources, again, depending on the product under evaluation. CDC's WHISKERS stands for Web-Based Injury Statistics Query and Reporting System. And that's also an interactive online database that provides fatal and non-fatal injury, violent death, and cost of injury data from a variety of trusted sources. Researchers, the media, public health professionals, and the public can use WHISKERS data to learn more about the public health and economic burden associated with unintended and violence-related injury in the United States. One can also consult available anthropometric data, such as adult data and child data, which include dimensions of pretty much every part of the body at various ages, and it also includes strength data. So this helps to assess whether the intended user of a product under evaluation would be able to successfully use the product based on its size and shape. The Older Adult Data Handbook is a collection of ergonomics data on adults over 50 years old and includes 155 anthropometric body size measurements, 22 range of motion measurements, 30 strength measurements, and 10 measurements of performance capabilities. All of these are intended to provide data to help products be designed for safety. And then there's saferproducts.gov. This is a public product safety database that was created as part of the Consumer Product Safety Improvement Act of 2008. It includes not only the CPSC recalls, which we've talked about, but it also allows anyone to make a report of harm or potential harm. Members of the public can search the database for safety information about products that are in their home already or that they may be thinking about purchasing. They can provide those reports of harm that will be posted in the database. So product manufacturers, including importers and private labelers that are identified in a report, may submit comments to be displayed in the database along with the report. Strongly recommended that you register your company in this database so that you'll be automatically notified anytime one of your products or your company name is included in a report. And this will allow you to respond promptly if desired, or to take any other necessary action. And the database provides insight into how consumers are actually using a product and any challenges they may be having. And then for all products regulated by the CPSC, the Commission issues a letter of advice at LOA when there's a violation of a mandatory standard. It advises the company of the violation and of the nature of the necessary corrective action, which could be to correct future production, to stop sale and correct future production, or to recall, stop sale, and correct future production. These LOAs are available at the link shown here, and each LOA includes the product, of course, and the primary violation, the action requested, the company name and address, country of manufacture. It's searchable. Shown here are just the first few LOAs that popped up when I searched under clothing. In addition to all of the external data we've just discussed, your current customers can give you valuable feedback to help you address any issues with current product and help you reduce these issues with future product. Customer complaints are a good source of information regarding consumers' interactions with the product. Your customer service team can gather great information based on feedback from the actual customers. So keywords such as injury, doctor, hurt can be used to help sort through the call summaries and identify potential issues. Ideally, you can get the product in question back from the consumer so you can do a forensic type of evaluation. You know, is it a one-off issue related perhaps to gross misuse? Or is it an issue that could be inherent in all of the product? Look at your returns. Are there an unusual amount of returns or certain parts that consistently require replacement? This could indicate a poor design, and this information can be used to improve future similar product. Look at online reviews of your product or similar product. Any safety-related complaint should not just be noted by customer service. There should be an escalation process for product safety-related complaints. And this feedback should be shared with product designers and engineers, along with product integrity and compliance managers. All companies should maintain a central repository for incident reports and other customer feedback related to safety. You're going to need it not just for hazard identification, but also if there are issues that could lead to a recall. What did you know and when did you know it? So once you've identified potential hazards that may be associated with your product, using the various resources that we've just discussed, you want to document them and address them. And there are various tools that can be used. I like using a standardized checklist, whether it's one developed internally based on your particular product type, or a generic one available in the standards or guidelines. A checklist can help ensure, A, that you're consistent in the evaluation of your product and you're not overlooking a known potential hazard. And then B, it documents if the hazard has been addressed. And the excerpt here shows potential mechanical hazards as well as thermal hazards. And the list goes on, obviously. So, once you've identified potential hazards, you need to assess the risks that these hazards may present. And this involves a risk assessment. Not every hazard may need to be addressed. As mentioned at the start of this webinar, every consumer product has potential hazards. The FMEA process, failure mode and effects analysis, helps to quantify the risk associated with each potential hazard. There are various models that can be used. Typical is a two-factor model that evaluates the probability that an injury associated with the hazard will occur and the severity of that injury. And exposure is another factor that can be considered. An injury that's unlikely to occur, but if it does causes significant injury or even death, needs to be addressed. An injury that is likely to occur but is not severe, maybe not. You likely can't address every possible hazard. So being able to quantify can help with your risk assessment in determining which potential hazards need to be addressed. OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, which is a group of regulatory agencies from 21 countries, uses similar approaches. FMEA is also mentioned in CPSC's Handbook for Manufacturing Safer Consumer Products as an approach that identifies the components of a design or the functions of a process and their potential consequences of failure. So in other words, this process is a systematic method for identifying the severity and likelihood of failures or injuries. And you're probably familiar with the safety hierarchy, sometimes called the hazard control hierarchy. It's essentially a scheme for dealing with product hazards and risks. The best and most effective method is to eliminate the hazard, design it out. Do you need those decorative plastic flowers on the child's skirt, which may detach and present a choking hazard? Or can you design out this potential small part choking hazard by using embroidery or another means to decorate the skirt? If it's not feasible or desirable to design out the hazard, then one should guard against the hazard. Ideally, prevent contact between the user and the hazard. Or, using the skirt example, you could use redundant assembly, two independent methods of attachment, to help ensure that the small part does not detach. And then lastly, if you're not able to design the hazard out or to adequately guard against the hazard, then warning the consumer about the hazard is the last line of defense and the least effective. So when should you design out the hazard? Going back to our FMEA discussion, a hazard should be eliminated or designed out when there's a high likelihood of the hazard occurring and or where the severity of the injury is high and where it's feasible. So baby walkers provide a good example of how the hazard of falling downstairs was addressed. This was a well-known hazard, highly foreseeable, with potentially quite serious injuries. And so walkers were modified to address this hazard by increasing the overall width of the base so that it wouldn't fit through most doorways. And there's a type of braking device on the front wheels that stops the walker should the front wheels drop over the edge of a step. And there's now a federal regulation that incorporates these design requirements. And the design modification does need to be technologically feasible. A knife needs to be sharp to function properly. And, there also may be financial considerations. There's many instances where the hazard simply cannot be designed out. A lawnmower must have sharp blades in order to work properly, but guards can be put in place to help prevent injury to the user. In the picture shown here, both physical guards as well as procedural guards are used. Physical guards are often in the form of personal protective equipment, such as the eye protection, sturdy shoes, and long pants of this lawnmower man. The lawnmower itself has a physical guard that shields the blades. A procedural guard prevents people from coming in contact with the hazard. In the case of the lawnmower, both hands have to be on the handle to activate it. And when using a guard, it's critical that there be appropriate manufacturing controls to ensure that the guard is properly manufactured and assembled. And these are critical processes that need to be monitored throughout production. Faulty guard means the hazard's still present. Another example of guarding against a hazard and the criticality of the manufacturing process is with a baby rattle. A baby rattle typically contains small beads inside to make the rattle noise. One can't really design out the small beads, but instead you have to rely on the proper manufacturing and assembly of the two halves of the rattle to ensure that the two halves don't separate. The separation would expose the small beads and present a choking hazard to infants. So with this type of guard, it's critical that the factory have proper manufacturing controls and in-process monitoring to ensure consistently compliant product that can eliminate the risk of choking on small beads. And lastly, one can warn about the hazard. Least effective, but certainly has its place as an important safety communication where the potential hazard can't be effectively designed out or guarded against, and where one feels comfortable accepting the potential risk and alerting consumers to it. The warnings may be used in conjunction with the guards or on their own. Some of the warnings may seem like overkill, like the do not use these scrubbing bubbles for personal hygiene. There are standards such as ANSI Z535 that provide guidelines on producing an effective warning, from location and size to the wording, colors, and symbols. And there are standards that include specific warnings, such as the ASTM candle warnings pictured here, and the small parts, small ball, and balloon warnings, which are codified in 16 CFR 1500.19. Important to note that even the best warnings are not 100% effective, and people may not see the warning. They may ignore it. They may not understand it. So we've identified the potential hazards, we've assessed their risks, and taken appropriate actions. And now we're going to talk about how risk management can and should be incorporated into every step of a product life cycle. As seen here, risk management starts with the product concept and identifying and mitigating any potential hazards, then selecting the right factory. Pre-production evaluation qualifies the materials and design, and then the production testing is the regulatory compliance and safety testing. Safe transportation and timely distribution of the product all factor into those happy customers with brand loyalty. So on the next few slides, we're going to review these phases in a bit more detail. The product concept phase is in large part the creative process. During this time, designers develop ideas and concepts that may eventually turn into tangible products. In terms of product safety during this phase, a human factors review and hazard identification are important steps to help protect both consumers and your company. As we've discussed, this type of review goes beyond the regulatory standards and tries to anticipate foreseeable use and unintended use scenarios. This type of evaluation helps identify and reduce or mitigate potential hazards early in the design phase to reduce the possibility for injury and product recalls. Once the concepts are vetted, a more detailed design evaluation can be performed and a full risk assessment done. Information such as product dimensions, materials to be used, components, and assembly methods are assessed. And you also need to consider your intended audience, including appropriate age for children's products. With the information gathered during this process, one should also consider the testing and the labeling requirements, any potential concerns in meeting compliance, any potential concerns with manufacturing the product consistently and safely. And even the best designed product can run into issues if the wrong factory is selected to manufacture the product. How can one feel confident that the product will be produced in a consistently compliant manner using fair business practices? Factory audits play an important role in the vendor selection process. There are many different types of audits. Some of them are listed here for your reference. An audit can evaluate the factory's manufacturing capabilities, management structure, quality control processes, document control, and working conditions. The factory audit may also evaluate other concerns that may impact product quality, timeliness of deliveries, and the capacity of the factory. A factory audit can give insight into the reliability and quality of your suppliers and the quality of the products sourced from these suppliers, as well as processes in place to help protect your company and intellectual property. For social compliance, ethical audits provide business with intelligence and tools that help them develop and implement sustainable business practices within their supply chains and help ensure that their products are made in a socially and ethically responsible manner, without child or forced labor, and with fair wages, working hours, and acceptable conditions. And in addition to audits, consider your factory's experience with your type of product. Has any of their products been recalled? And if so, why? Is this factory included in any of CPSC's letter of advice? How financially stable are they? You need to find the right factory to produce your wonderfully designed product. So, now that you have a safe design and selected an appropriate factory, the pre-production phase is the time to vet the materials, the production techniques, and proposed final product labeling and artwork before mass production starts and any errors become quite costly. Raw materials qualifications, typically a chemical analysis of the materials that will be used in production to determine compliance. So this testing often includes lead, phthalates, cadmium, and other heavy metals. It may include azo dyes, formaldehyde, and other testing, depending on the material and area of distribution. Research testing or testing to failure may be performed on mechanical or performance aspects of the product to determine not just compliance, but how far above the set limit does the product perform and how consistent is that performance. So statistical analysis of these results, often in the form of a Z-value, may be performed. And pre-production mechanical testing of pilot or first-run product is recommended. And it should include samples from each mold and assembly line to provide confidence to go into mass production. Production readiness assessment may include a review of the factory's quality control plan for your product, and labeling verification and artwork approval, while perhaps not safety related, are important steps in the pre-production phase. The marketing must match the age of the intended user, and age labeling may be required or recommended depending on the product. And then lastly, a confirmation based on pilot or first run product of the aesthetic and functional expectations should be performed. You know, with all the various regulations and restrictions on chemicals, including state chemicals of high concern reporting requirements, it's important at this phase, prior to mass production, that a robust chemical management program be in place. You need to know all of the chemicals used in your factory, not just the chemicals used for your particular product. I was involved in an interesting cross-contamination case several years back. The wet inks were fully compliant with the chemical requirements, and yet some of the screen-printed shirts were found to have high levels of lead. So after researching how this was possible, it was found that the screens used for screen printing were cleaned periodically, as they should be, but with leaded gasoline. So the first few shirts printed using the newly cleaned screens were high in lead. An example of cross-contamination. Ideally, you don't want any unacceptable chemicals used in your factory. And you need to ensure that the entire supply chain is aware of the chemical requirements of your particular RSL or any other restrictions. And there should be a robust process for accepting all incoming chemicals to ensure they're acceptable. And then during the mass production phase, there are a number of actions that can be taken. From a testing standpoint, regulatory compliance is critical. And testing for compliance may be mandatory, such as for children's products, which must be tested by a CPSC-accepted third-party laboratory and certified as compliant with applicable product safety requirements. If all the upfront steps we've just discussed have been done properly, the production compliance testing really should just be a verification. There may be other safety tests appropriate for your product. Remember that regulatory compliance does not always equal safety, and any label's claims should be substantiated. From a quality and consumer satisfaction standpoint, testing for quality and performance, function, and durability may be appropriate. Product comparisons and sensory evaluations may be performed, and any non-compliance or less than satisfactory results should undergo a formal corrective action process that identifies the root cause and steps to correct the failure. Random and representative sample selection is another important part of the production process. You want to avoid golden samples, which are samples specifically designed and selected by the factory that will pass testing. They're not necessarily representative of the entire lot. Companies can have third-party inspectors go into the factory and pull random samples for testing to avoid this. Typically, samples are selected from product in the final package state. And in addition to product testing, there are a number of audits and inspections that assess the production process to help ensure consistently compliant product. Process audits differ from the factory audits we discussed as part of vendor selection, in that the process audit evaluates the quality controls and processes specific to the product being produced rather than the entire factory's processes. Having critical control points identified is important, and are they being properly monitored? Some manufacturers have QC inspectors at the factory throughout production as part of production monitoring. And quality inspections will help companies provide quality consistent products that conform to agreed upon standards and specifications. And these can be done at various phases throughout production as listed here. In general, a quality inspection will help reduce the amount of unsatisfactory product that reaches your customer, and therefore reduce product return rates and dissatisfaction. These inspections can help prevent defective product from even leaving the manufacturer's facility. Inspections are really a cost-effective means to help ensure that product meets your quality standards as well as your customers prior to shipment. And then when you reach the transportation and distribution stages, loading inspections can help ensure that product is safely loaded with no tampering or contamination. CTPAT compliance can help facilitate shipment, as can importer self-assessment programs. CTPAT is a voluntary supply chain security program led by CBP and focused on improving the security of supply chains with respect to terrorism. The program was launched in 2001 and currently has over 10,000 certified partners. And one of the benefits of this program is that CTPAT members are considered low risk and are therefore less likely to be examined at the ports. And the last phase of a product life cycle is when it reaches the consumer. Once a product is on the market or has been distributed to the customer, there are still activities you can do to assess the product and the effectiveness of the brand. Market surveillance testing means pulling product from the store shelves and performing validation testing to evaluate whether the product that actually reaches consumer hands is compliant and looks and performs as intended. Large retailers often perform this type of evaluation. Distribution center or store inspections, again, help confirm that the product going to the consumer is acceptable. Vendor return analysis and failure evaluations are important for many reasons. One is that the returns related to safety may indicate the need for a recall, so you need to receive this information and document it accordingly. And understanding how consumers are using your product and any issues they're having help with the concept and design reviews we discussed at the start of the product life cycle. If consumers are having difficulties with a product, you need to know about it, and you can perhaps take that into account with the next similar product. You know, we talked about this early on as one of the ways to identify potential hazards and mitigate risk. It's the circle of life. And if there are customer concerns and complaints related to product safety, there are CPSC requirements for reporting. Many of the recent fines levied by CPSC against certain companies were due in part to late reporting when companies had knowledge of consumer injuries with their products. And so what we've just discussed is a risk management program, which is much more than just the finished product testing to assess compliance. But again, so important to go beyond the regulations, to identify potential hazards and manage their risks, and to help ensure consistent production to provide compliant and safe product. You know, in the end, everyone wants the same thing: safe and compliant product, delivered on time and within budget, and with minimized risk. And I just want to end by saying that QIMA is here to help you every step of the way throughout your product life cycle. And now I believe we are happy to take questions.
Great, thanks, Susan. Yep, we've got a couple minutes for questions now. So just as a reminder to anybody on the webinar right now, if you have any questions, please do put those in your question box so that we can discuss those on the webinar. We do have a couple of questions here to start with. So Susan, just looking at all of the regulations that companies have to comply with in the US for one, but also internationally, how do companies stay on top of regulations and then industry and voluntary standards on top of that? How would you advise companies to approach that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it is a challenge, certainly, to keep up to date on all of the regulations that may affect your product. So there's some great resources. Industry organizations such as AAFA and the Toy Association provide newsletters with regulatory updates to their members. AAFA also has a Product Safety Council, which provides some in-depth regulatory tracking of US regulations. I'd also look at the labs. I mean, it's our job to stay on top of the requirements and ensure that our customers are aware. So you can sign up for free for the newsletters from any of the labs. I know we have a regulatory recap that goes out monthly, and so do most all of the other major labs. So they provide a great resource. You can also participate in the ASTM committees, for example. If you have a particular product, if you're making jewelry, for example, join the ASTM subcommittee for jewelry. It really helps keep you up to date on not just the standard, but also any concerns that are being addressed, any potential changes to the standard, and it gives you a voice in the process. I mean, participating in those consensus standard committees are really valuable. And there's conferences. So AAFA does a conference, one on the West Coast, one on the East Coast each year. Very good, focused on product safety. There's ICFSO conferences. They have their annual major symposium at the end of February every year. So there are resources out there, many of which are free, like the lab bulletins and the industry updates. But it's out there. And I would really, again, I would suggest you talk to your lab partner also about just how to stay on top.
Great, thank you. So we've just had a question come in about, all the many different components that make up a lot of the products that companies in our industries are making, and sort of the opaqueness of supply chains sometimes. So can you kind of speak to strategies that companies can use to protect themselves to make sure that textile products and trims and components don't contain any hazardous chemicals?
Yeah, and it's certainly a challenge because, as you said, the components may come from any number of suppliers. So I think the first thing really is to know your supply chain. Make sure that the factory that you're using to make your finished product has all of their processes in place, and that would include robust incoming material controls. Make sure that they source only from reliable suppliers, reliable component manufacturers. Ask them, how do they select their component manufacturers, and how do they ensure that what's being brought into the factory is acceptable? And then again, I really think that chemical management program is important, because you don't want to run the risk of that cross-contamination. So, make sure you know all the factories, all the chemicals that are in your production factory. It's really just understanding the process. It's so much more than 20 years ago, you just imported a product and that was it. Now you really need to know what goes into your product, where the components come from, what chemicals are in the components. Because the finished product testing is only going to give you a snapshot of the product that was tested. You really need a more robust risk management program like we just talked about.
Great, thank you. Sort of the other side of that, there are many components in the products, but many companies often make a number of different products themselves. So doing a risk assessment for all of those different products is a very daunting task, and can be a financially intensive task as well. What would you kind of suggest for balance there in doing the right amount of risk assessment for all of your many different product categories and different SKUs for each individual product, compared with the financial burden there?
Right. No, that's a great question. It's one we get for Prop 65 too. I can't test all of my products. So from a risk assessment standpoint, I would suggest, first of all, you prioritize the products. Let's categorize them into high, medium, and low risk. And so you look at different factors. You look at the target age. Anything for children is a higher risk item than something for adults in general. You look at the quantity. How many are going on the market? Is it hundreds, or is it 100,000s of pieces going on the market? You look at the products and whether similar products have been recalled. Look at the factory that you're using. Do you have a long history with them? Are they very familiar with manufacturing that type of product? What's your history with the product? So really, I think the first step would be to categorize the different products in your product line, and then look at those that you've identified as high risk and really start there.
Great, thank you. So I think we have time for about one more question here. Just kind of wondering, I know you went into this a lot in your presentation this afternoon, but can you kind of give just a high level of what are the big product quality testing that companies should be doing specific to apparel and shoes? Just being aware of things like CPSIA and others. What are maybe the main tests, the most common tests that you all would recommend running for these product categories, whether it's specific chemicals or specific hazards that are the most common to look out for?
Right, and of course, it goes without saying with apparel, you have your flammable fabric requirement. That's been in place since the 50s. So you're always going to have to meet the flammability requirements. Then I would suggest looking at, is it children's apparel? If it is, try to avoid having small components on it that could detach. That's where a lot of the recalls, the majority of the recalls of children's apparel comes from, is with small part detachment. And sometimes you can't avoid it. You need to secure the jacket in some way, whether it's a zipper or buttons or snaps, no drawstrings. But when you decide on what hard attachment you're going to use, then make sure that it's securely attached. Make sure that the factory's done this type of product before, that they have robust processes in place, including redundant assembly where possible. So that's something with children's apparel, always look for any potential small part detachments. And then look at really the foreseeable use of a product. Do performance assessments, you know, things like cycle testing, open and close cycle testing. You know, with shoes, you want to make sure that they can withstand, and there's a lot of ASTM tests for shoes to make sure that they can withstand the type of use and abuse they're going to get. So I really look at the intended use of the product as well. And then things like, you know, Colorfastness. There's AATCC standards for Colorfastness, and they're technically voluntary, although certain retailers certainly have requirements. But I know I saw complaints several years ago, with a children's toy that had a black, like a Batman cape on it, and the child was sucking on the material and the black dye came off in his mouth. Not a hazard, but greatly alarmed the consumer. So, you know, not a safety issue, but certainly a perceived concern by the consumer. So look at, again, the industry standards and adopt those that make sense for your product. You don't have to do all of them, you know, but look at the ones that make sense for your product.
Great. Thank you so much, Susan. The presentation today was very informative, and thank you to QIMA for sponsoring the program. To all of our participants on the webinar today, you'll receive an email with links to the PDF and a recording of the presentation. So thank you all again for joining, and have a great day.